They told me my well water wasn't mine. The HOA claimed it belonged to the community, and suddenly, I was facing threats, fines, and legal notices I didn't even understand. Every knock on the door felt like another escalation. Every call from the board sent my blood racing. How could something as simple as water spiral into a full-blown battle with my own neighborhood? I was about to discover just how far an HOA could go to take what's rightfully mine, and the shocking twist no one saw coming would change everything. Before the storm hit, life felt almost perfect. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where streets were lined with neat lawns and families waved as they drove by. My house wasn't the biggest, but it was mine. My sanctuary. The place where summer mornings smelled of fresh coffee, and the air carried the faint scent of pine from the small grove behind the property. Water came from my own well, hidden behind tall grass and a rustling grove of trees. It wasn't flashy or remarkable, but it had always been ours, reliable, clean, and private. My family spent weekends around the backyard fire pit, kids running barefoot, laughter echoing against the fences that separated our little slice of the world from the rest of the neighborhood. Everything seemed ordinary, safe, predictable. Then came the first subtle sign that not everything was as harmonious as it appeared. A letter slipped under the door, official looking, warning me that the HOA had concerns about my well. At first, I thought it was routine, maybe a new inspection requirement or some minor guideline I had overlooked. But there was something in the tone that didn't sit right, a quiet insistence, a suggestion that what I thought was private might not be so. Neighbors I had greeted for years suddenly started looking at me differently. Board members made passing comments during community events. Small remarks that hinted at scrutiny, at rules that weren't entirely clear. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but I could feel it. A tension under the surface of our perfect little streets. It didn't take long for that tension to reveal itself. What had been a simple, private life, centered around family and my well, was about to become the battleground for a conflict I could never have imagined. Something as simple as water, something I had taken for granted every day, was about to spark a fight that would pull me into the heart of a neighborhood war, testing not just my patience, but the limits of authority and ownership itself. The first fine arrived like a punch I didn't see coming. A crisp envelope, bearing the HOA logo, landed on the doormat one morning, its contents simple yet devastating. A $250 citation for unauthorized water usage. I stared at the letter, disbelief gripping me. Unauthorized. My well had been in use for decades. It had nourished my lawn, filled our taps, and been the heartbeat of my home. How could it suddenly belong to the HOA? I tried calling the board, hoping for clarity. I imagined a quick conversation, a reasonable explanation. Instead, I reached voicemail after voicemail. When I finally got someone on the phone, the tone was polite, almost cordial, but laced with a quiet authority that left no room for negotiation. The board has determined, they said, that your well falls under our jurisdiction. You will need to cease private usage immediately, or additional fines will be applied. That last line hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to fall. At first, I attempted compliance. Not because I agreed, but because I needed time to gather facts, to figure out what legal ground I had. But compliance only seemed to fuel the fire. Another letter arrived, warning that the fines would escalate monthly, eventually reaching thousands if ignored. It was impossible to keep up. Even more confusing, the rules cited were vague, referencing community water regulations that didn't exist anywhere in the HOA's official documents I had access to. Neighbors, too, began to change. A friendly wave at the mailbox was met with stares of judgment, whispered conversations that abruptly ceased when I approached. One afternoon, while tending to the garden, I noticed a board member standing at the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, pretending to admire the landscaping. Their eyes, however, were sharp, assessing, calculating. It was harassment in plain sight. Every small action of mine, watering the lawn, filling a bucket, even letting the kids play in the yard, suddenly felt like an act of rebellion, as if my normal life was a provocation. The absurdity escalated quickly. One morning, I returned home to find bright orange tape stretched across the perimeter of my well. A sign declared, "Property under HOA review. Unauthorized use prohibited." They had marked my private water source like a crime scene, as if declaring ownership by proximity alone. It wasn't just intimidation. It was a power play designed to strip me of something I had never questioned, never doubted, never thought anyone else could claim. I decided to push back. I started attending board meetings, sitting silently at the back while members discussed rules and fines with a smug sense of self-importance. I watched them cite arbitrary regulations, laugh over minor infractions by other residents, and treat the meetings as theatrical exercises in control. My heart pounded every time my turn to speak came. They listened politely, nodding, then dismissed my questions with rehearsed phrases. "The board's decision is final," or "This falls under community policy." The more I sought answers, the more I realized that the rules were a weapon, not a guideline. Legal threats began to follow. Letters from lawyers, drafted in dense, intimidating language, arrived weekly. Each one referenced clauses in the HOA's governing documents that seemed to have no bearing on my well. Or worse, didn't exist at all. I spent hours comparing documents, researching state property laws, and calling attorneys, only to be met with explanations that confirmed my worst fear. This was a battle designed to exhaust me, financially and emotionally. Even daily life became a minefield. A casual stroll to check the mailbox now carried the risk of confrontation. Board members seemed to appear at random, observing, questioning, taking notes. One neighbor, previously friendly, whispered rumors to others, claiming I was hoarding community resources. The isolation was subtle but effective, like slowly closing a vise around me. The people I had trusted, the neighborhood I had loved, were now instruments in a campaign that felt increasingly personal. Then came the surveillance. Hidden cameras, so I later discovered, had been installed on properties bordering mine, capturing footage of my yard and well. It was unsettling to know that my every movement, watering plants, filling bottles, even hosting family gatherings, was being recorded and potentially used against me. I felt violated, powerless, and enraged all at once. This was no longer about water. It was about control, dominance, and the ability of a small group to dictate my life. Attempts at negotiation yielded nothing. Board members offered compromises that were impossible to accept. Pay hefty fees for a private water permit, submit to inspections at their whim, or risk continued fines. Each option seemed designed to humiliate, frustrate, and bend me into submission. My frustration grew alongside my determination. I knew the well was mine, and I knew the law was on my side. But fighting against an organized HOA felt like tilting against a fortress of rules and regulations that constantly shifted under my feet. Escalation took on new forms. One morning, I discovered a formal complaint filed against me for disturbing neighborhood aesthetics, citing the well's exposed pipes as an eyesore. Another board member sent an anonymous tip to the county, claiming I was illegally distributing water beyond my property. a claim I had never even considered. The tension built with every notice, every rumor, every unsolicited inspection. My life, once predictable and calm, now revolved around monitoring correspondence, recording encounters, and preparing for the next surprise attack. The stress seeped into everything. Family dinners were interrupted by calls from lawyers or neighbors. Sleep became fractured by worry about fines and inspections. My children asked why the HOA seemed to dislike us, and I had no simple answer. The world I had thought was safe, the streets, the fences, the familiar faces, had transformed into a battlefield. Each day felt like walking a tightrope over an unseen pit, one misstep away from financial ruin or public humiliation. Then, the most insidious tactic began: intimidation through public perception. Flyers appeared in the community, vaguely warning residents about illegal water usage and community liability. Thinly veiled references to my property. Friends I had known for years began to hesitate before visiting. I felt trapped in my own home, a captive in a conflict that had begun with something as basic and vital as water. Despite the mounting obstacles, I refused to yield. I documented every interaction, every letter, every inspection. I researched laws, consulted attorneys, and prepared for a fight I knew would be long and exhausting. And yet, every step forward seemed to trigger a new escalation. The HOA had mastered a cruel rhythm. Each time I found leverage, they raised the stakes, their actions more aggressive, their demands more absurd. One day, as I returned from an appointment, I found the well capped with a lock bearing the HOA's insignia. A final, audacious declaration of ownership. They hadn't just sent letters, they had physically intervened, turning my private resource into a public battlefield. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was a full-blown war over control, power, and principle. And that was the point where everything changed. The letters, the fines, the inspections, they were only the beginning. What came next would test every ounce of patience, courage, and resourcefulness I had. The battle for something as simple as water was about to explode into a confrontation no one could ignore. Everything came to a head on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the neighborhood I once loved, now feeling more like a cage than a community. The latest notice had arrived just that morning, a final warning, this time accompanied by a threat of immediate legal action and the possibility of physically shutting off my well. My blood ran cold. Years of subtle intimidation, escalating fines, and relentless scrutiny had led to this single moment. I realized I could no longer sit back and hope reason would prevail. The fight had to be direct, unflinching, and public. I gathered every piece of documentation. I had copies of HOA rules, letters, legal correspondences, and photographs of my well. How long it had been there, how private it was, and the absurdity of their claims. I had spent sleepless nights piecing together the law, studying state statutes about private utilities and water rights, and preparing for a confrontation that would leave no room for manipulation. For the first time, I felt a fierce clarity. I wasn't just defending water, I was defending my home, my family, and my dignity. When I arrived at the board's monthly meeting, the room smelled of polished wood, stale coffee, and authority. Board members settled into their chairs with an air of smug confidence, expecting me to appear as a compliant, overwhelmed homeowner. Instead, I stepped into the room with quiet determination, documents clutched like armor. The meeting had been scheduled for routine budget approvals, but everyone knew, at least I knew, that it was about to become the battleground. The president of the HOA, a woman who had consistently wielded power with icy precision, looked up at me and raised an eyebrow. Her smile was polite but condescending, a shield against the chaos she expected to maintain. "I understand you have concerns regarding your well," she said, her tone measured. "Perhaps you'd like to speak." I did more than speak. I laid out the facts with precision. Each letter, each fine, each arbitrary rule violation was presented clearly, systematically dismantling the board's claims one by one. I cited state laws confirming my rights to private water use, referenced property statutes, and highlighted the inconsistencies in the HOA's governing documents. As I spoke, I noticed shifts around the room, whispers among board members, hurried glances at papers, a flicker of doubt in their usually unflappable expressions. But the board wasn't going to fold quietly. Midway through my presentation, the room erupted in protest. "You're misinterpreting the rules!" one board member shouted. "The community has a right to enforce standards." Another slammed a gavel onto the table, trying to assert control. The room descended into chaos, but I stood firm, my voice rising above the din, not with anger, but with undeniable conviction. Each word landed like a hammer, shattering their facade of authority. Then came the most audacious attempt yet. One member reached for a legal document, claiming it granted the HOA temporary control over private wells in cases of dispute. My heart raced. This was the move they had been building toward, a final play designed to strip me of my rights without public scrutiny. But I had anticipated it. I pulled out a certified copy of state law, pointing to the exact clause that invalidated any such claim. The room fell silent. My evidence wasn't debatable, it was irrefutable. Tension mounted as the board scrambled. Their whispers grew louder, fingers tapped nervously on the table, and a low murmur of disbelief spread across the audience of residents. For weeks, I had felt trapped by the HOA's relentless campaign. But here, under the scrutiny of everyone present, the power dynamics shifted. The board members, who had once seemed untouchable, now faced a public reckoning. Their carefully constructed authority was crumbling, and I could almost see the cracks forming in real time. It wasn't over yet. As I concluded my presentation, an elderly resident rose from the back of the room. She had witnessed the harassment firsthand, and spoke with quiet gravitas. Her words were simple but piercing. "We've lived here for decades. We've seen families come and go. I've never seen anyone treated the way this homeowner has been treated over something so basic as water. Maybe it's time the board remembered who we serve." The statement rippled through the room like a shockwave. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just defending rules. They were defending themselves under the scrutiny of the entire community. The president tried to regain control, calling for a vote on whether to proceed with enforcement, but momentum had shifted. Voices rose. Residents demanding fairness, questioning the validity of fines, pointing out inconsistencies, and expressing frustration at the board's overreach. The chaos that had once seemed threatening now worked in my favor. The tension I had felt for months, the sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, condensed into a single, tangible forced public accountability. Then, the final blow to their facade arrived, an unexpected ally. A state inspector, responding to an anonymous tip, appeared at the meeting with official documents confirming my well's status as a private utility. The inspector's presence was a bombshell. The board could no longer argue, threaten, or intimidate. They were confronted by legal authority that directly contradicted their claims. Murmurs turned to audible gasps. Faces that had once radiated control now reflected shock and panic. The meeting devolved into a frenzy. Some board members attempted to argue technicalities, but the inspector patiently explained the law, pointing out that any further fines or threats could result in personal liability. Their power, carefully cultivated over months, had evaporated under the weight of truth, law, and public scrutiny. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I had felt powerless, trapped in my own home, scrutinized at every turn. Now, I stood on the verge of victory, and it was undeniable. In the final moments, the president leaned back in her chair, face pale, voice trembling as she muttered about procedures and future review. I didn't need to respond. The room itself told the story. Residents nodding in support, the inspector standing as an unassailable authority, and board members retreating into silence. My family, who had sat through weeks of tension and worry, exchanged quiet, incredulous glances. Relief and vindication washed over me like a tide long denied. And yet, even in triumph, the emotional weight of the ordeal lingered. Months of stress, fear, and confrontation had taken a toll. I thought about the letters, the inspections, the whispered gossip, and the locked well. I thought about how a simple act of living, drawing water from my own property, had escalated into a months-long conflict with an entire neighborhood authority. But standing there, documents in hand, surrounded by those who had witnessed the absurdity and cruelty of the HOA's actions, I felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment. I hadn't just defended my water. I had defended my home, my rights, and my dignity. The final gavel of the meeting fell, not in favor of the board, but in acknowledgement that the fight was over. For the first time in months, I could breathe without tension clawing at my chest. The HOA had pushed too far, and their overreach had been exposed in front of everyone. The community, once a backdrop of intimidation and silent scrutiny, now bore witness to the truth. Justice had been delivered, not through vengeance, but through persistence, preparation, and the undeniable clarity of law. As I walked out of that meeting, the late afternoon sun illuminating the familiar streets, I felt the magnitude of what had just happened. I had faced the peak of the HOA's abuse, navigated their intimidation, and emerged victorious. But more importantly, I had sent a message, not just to them, but to every homeowner who might one day face similar tyranny. Knowledge, courage, and perseverance can topple even the most entrenched power structures. And yet, as I looked at the well behind my home, still standing, still private, I couldn't help but wondered, would the board retreat quietly, or were there more battles ahead, lurking just beneath the surface of our deceptively peaceful neighborhood? The weeks after the climactic showdown felt surreal. The tension that had gripped my life for months didn't vanish overnight, but its shape had changed. The letters stopped coming. The inspections ceased. The fines disappeared from my mailbox like a bad dream, slowly fading into memory. For the first time in months, I could move freely in my own home without calculating whether each action would trigger another punitive notice. My well, my private, reliable, long taken for granted source of water, was finally uncontested, yet the real impact went beyond mere possession of water. The neighborhood itself had shifted. Residents who had once whispered and stared now approached openly, some offering apologies, others sharing their own experiences of minor intimidation by the board. There was a collective recognition that the HOA had overstepped, and for the first time in years, a sense of solidarity emerged among neighbors who had felt powerless individually. It was a subtle but profound transformation. A fractured community, previously bound by fear and control, was beginning to rebuild itself on transparency and accountability. The HOA board, predictably, did not vanish quietly. Some members resigned in the aftermath of public exposure, their positions untenable after months of mismanagement and public scrutiny. Others remained but were forced to operate under significantly stricter oversight. Policies were rewritten, fines reconsidered, and a new framework was established to prevent the arbitrary enforcement that had caused months of anxiety. For me, seeing the board humbled was a quiet vindication, proof that even entrenched authority could be held accountable when challenged with facts, law, and courage. For my family, life slowly returned to a semblance of normality, though the shadow of the conflict lingered in memory. My children played in the yard without fear, though occasionally they would pause, recalling the tension of months past. My spouse and I spent evenings reflecting on the ordeal, realizing how much the struggle had tested our patience, our resolve, and our belief in fairness. But there was also pride. We had stood firm against unreasonable power and emerged victorious. That pride was a lesson in resilience that no fine, no letter, and no arbitrary rule could take away. Community meetings now carried a different tone. Where once they had been arenas of intimidation and passive compliance, they became forums for genuine discussion. Residents asked questions, debated policies, and demanded transparency. The fear that had once kept people silent evaporated. What had begun as a deeply personal struggle had grown into a catalyst for neighborhood-wide reform. The fight over a single well had revealed systemic flaws, and exposing them had created space for meaningful change. Legally, the outcome was equally significant. The state inspector's involvement not only validated my claims, but set a precedent. The recognition of my well as a private utility meant that future attempts by the HOA, or any similar organization, to claim personal property would be met with firm, enforceable boundaries. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement about the limits of communal authority over private property. Lawyers later confirmed that the HOA's overreach could have opened them to liability, further cementing the broader implications of the fight. Socially, the experience altered the perception of the HOA in the neighborhood. No longer were they untouchable arbiters of arbitrary rules. Residents who had once been passive now engaged actively, questioning notices, verifying claims, and attending meetings armed with knowledge. The balance of power had shifted. Fear, the tool that had kept the board unchallenged for so long, had been replaced with awareness and vigilance. The lessons were clear: authority must be accountable, and silence is not always safe. Personally, the ordeal left lasting changes. I became more assertive, more attentive to the rights and responsibilities of property ownership, and more willing to confront injustice directly. There was a sense of empowerment that came from realizing that persistence, preparation, and an unwavering belief in fairness could counter even the most entrenched bureaucratic power. I carried that confidence into other areas of life, feeling capable of navigating challenges I might once have avoided. Yet the impact wasn't solely about triumph. The stress had real consequences. Weeks of anxiety had taken a toll on sleep, health, and daily routines. It was a reminder that while victory can be sweet, conflict exacts a price. Family, support networks, and community became even more valuable, highlighting the importance of alliances and preparation when facing organized opposition. Reflection on those months revealed the invisible costs of prolonged stress and the necessity of maintaining emotional and mental resilience. The neighborhood itself began to change in subtle but profound ways. Policies governing communal resources were clarified, with language designed to prevent the kind of ambiguity that had fueled my conflict. Notices and fines now required documentation, explanation, and transparency. Inspection procedures became standardized, limiting opportunities for personal bias or harassment. Even landscaping and aesthetic guidelines were adjusted to allow homeowners autonomy over reasonable personal decisions, as long as they met safety and legal standards. The HOA had learned, whether willingly or through necessity, that unchecked authority cannot operate in secrecy. Residents began to share stories of their own minor disputes, inspired by my fight. Petty rules, previously accepted in silence, were now questioned. One neighbor spoke of decades of arbitrary citations for minor aesthetic issues, and another detailed how a communal amenity had been withheld over trivial technicalities. Each story added weight to a growing culture of vigilance and engagement. My struggle had become a catalyst for a community to recognize its own rights, and in doing so, strengthen them collectively. Emotionally, the resolution carried a profound lesson. The ordeal revealed that power, when unchecked, can be intimidating, manipulative, and deeply unfair. But it also revealed that knowledge, preparation, and courage are equally potent. The months of conflict, though draining, had illuminated principles that were easy to forget in the rhythm of everyday life property. Rights matter, voices matter, and accountability is not negotiable. The fight over water had become a fight for dignity, fairness, and the right to live without constant fear of arbitrary authority. As time passed, I noticed a shift in myself that mirrored the changes in the neighborhood. I was less inclined to accept authority blindly, and more inclined to question decisions that affected me or others. I learned the value of documentation, legal clarity, and community engagement. I also learned patience. Battles are not won overnight, and persistence often determines outcomes as much as knowledge or skill. The personal growth, though forged in stress and adversity, became a lasting asset, one that extended beyond this particular conflict into all areas of life. There was also a sense of closure in simple, everyday experiences. Drawing water from my well became an act of quiet triumph. Filling a glass, watering the garden, or rinsing dishes no longer carried tension. They were symbolic of victory over bureaucracy, over intimidation, and over the anxiety that had once gripped my home. Even mundane moments held significance. The ordinary became extraordinary simply because it had once been under threat. Yet the broader takeaway resonated beyond my own experience. I began to speak with neighbors in other communities, sharing the story of my fight and emphasizing the importance of awareness and vigilance. The story became a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked, and simultaneously, a lesson in the efficacy of preparation, courage, and standing one's ground. What had started as a personal dispute became a blueprint for others facing similar challenges. In retrospect, the ordeal illuminated a profound truth: conflict, even when exhausting and stressful, can catalyze positive change. The HOA's overreach revealed vulnerabilities in governance, legal frameworks, and communal culture. By confronting the abuse directly, I not only reclaimed what was mine, but helped reshape the neighborhood for the better. Residents became empowered, policies became transparent, and the balance between authority and accountability shifted. The private well had been the spark, but the fire it ignited extended far beyond my property line. Looking back, I understood that the resolution was never just about winning. It was about asserting boundaries, demanding accountability, and inspiring others to recognize that they are not powerless. The long-term impact extended into community culture, personal resilience, and the broader understanding that vigilance and courage can transform even deeply entrenched systems of control. What had once seemed like a personal nightmare became a lesson in empowerment, rights, and the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. As months turned into years, the neighborhood settled into a new normal. The well remained mine, as it always should have, and the lessons of the conflict were woven into daily life. Residents were engaged, questions were welcomed, and arbitrary overreach became almost unthinkable. For my family, life returned to a rhythm that had been interrupted by fear and uncertainty, but one enriched by the knowledge that justice, preparation, and persistence could prevail. In the end, the experience left me with a question that still echoes. If standing up for something as simple as water can change an entire community, what else might we reclaim when we refuse to accept injustice quietly? The battle was over, but the impact on me, my family, and the neighborhood was enduring, a reminder that courage in the face of power is never wasted, and that even the smallest resources, defended with conviction, can transform lives.